is, tell us what your role is. Yeah, Calista.
So I'm a law student. My role is student clinician. And so I'm just working with the Office of Alleged Counsel this session.
Great. Well, nice to have you with us. And I understand you're going to be tag team a little bit here. We might bounce back a little bit between the bills, but we're going to hear about the trail accessibility research, which is good because that's the first piece we heard about earlier today too.
So I will be walking through H85, which is an act relating to the trail accessibility. This is just a short form bill that purposes to require that at least 10% of each newly constructed trail on state lands or using state funds be accessible to individuals with physical disabilities, and require that accessible trail build-outs use the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines. And that is it.
Pretty short.
Yeah. Are there any questions? No, they were probably answered earlier, but.
One question that I didn't ask earlier, and I don't know whether anybody else did, and I missed it, but just if you can tell us more about those guidelines, the Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines.
Sure.
That's what we
So these are guidelines that are legally enforceable standards for facilities, routes, and trails within the National Forest System. And so obviously that's only going to apply to, forests like the Green Mountain National Forest. And so, if we're looking at trails and state forests, these would only be guiding principles. So basically it sets out 3 different criteria, and any trails that meet this criteria have to meet the requirements set out in the guidelines.
Okay. And if we wanted to know more about the guidelines, would you or your office be a good place to turn?
Yeah, I can send the guidelines, the packet that I found.
Great. Representative Lipsky.
Did state lands, any public lands, whether or not they're using public funds or state funds, have to meet that 10%?
So based off of the language, the 10% is just applying to newly constructed trails on state lands or newly constructed trails using state funds. So I don't know if that answered.
In a case where we had sort of a dysfunctional trail and we're trying to upgrade it with state funds or public funds, that triggers, a total rebuild to make a trail accessible for under the ADA requirements.
So the USDA, the trail guidelines, there are, the different criteria as far as whether it's newly constructed or if it's just being renovated or changed, but it would go back to whether it's actually within the National Forest System. And if it is within outside of that, that would be up to the committee to decide how they would want that to apply.
And which committee is that you're talking about?
The Committee of Jurisdiction.
Ours. In writing the bill, yeah.
In drafting.
So the language here, as I think you're saying, this newly constructed trails, either on state lands or newly constructed trails using state funding. So if you have an existing trail and you get some state funding to do some work on it, to bring it up, to relocate part of it perhaps, this bill would not apply in that situation, sounds like.
It would not apply. Yes, that is the way I read the language.
All right. Other questions on this section? Representative Cole, did you have your hand up earlier?
I have a question. I'm just curious about the 10% number and where that came from. I mean, yeah. And who was a part of the discussion with that?
It might be a Representative Burrows question.
I think so too.
Unless you were assisting with the drafting and.
No, I was just assigned this.
Okay.
So.
Representative O'Brien?
I don't know if you can answer this, but just for our committee, but on like ADA accessibility at both national and state levels, are there different requirements for, say, Marsh Billings, National Park in Woodstock, as far as, those trails there versus like the Green Mountain National Forest, or same thing with the state, like recreational trails at state parks versus, state build or maintain trails in our state forest. Are there different levels of requirements?
So I'm not exactly sure, but from what I did read about these guidelines, there's different sets of guidelines for, whether it's like a national forest or national park. Different agencies have different guidelines for those things. So as far as the ADA specifically, I can't necessarily speak to that, but I can look into that and get back to you.
Okay, great, thank you. Why don't we bring up Ellen to walk us through the rest of the language.
Hello, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I'm going to talk about H131 and H467. So we'll get to H467, but it encompasses the language that Calista just read you, and it encompasses H131. And then it also has a third short form bill in it that you probably are familiar with. So H131 is also a short form bill. This one is focused on creating the Green Mountain Recreation Fund. So this bill proposes to establish the Green Mountain Recreation Fund as a sustainable source of funding for organizational capacity and recreation-related development and stewardship. The fund would be funded from 5% of the existing tax on gallonage sale of malt and vinous beverages. Malt beverages primarily refers to beer with less than 16% alcohol, and vinous beverages are alcoholic beverages made from fruit, which does include cider. I can't speak more to that at the moment because I don't really work in alcohol, but if you'd like to hear more about that tax, I could get back to you on that. The fund would be used to fund one full-time staff position at the Vermont Trails and Greenway Council, whose duties would be to administer membership to the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council, manage the Vermont Trails and Greenway Council meetings, activities, operation, and budget, routinely assess the needs of the Vermont Trail stewardship community, develop, manage, and deploy technical assistance resources for the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council members, and execute the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council advisory role to the Agency of Natural Resources as defined in statute. It would also fund one full-time staff position at the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, whose duties would be to administer membership to the Vermont Trail System, ensure members comply with the Vermont Trail System program requirements, provide support to the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council, provide technical assistance to the Vermont Trail System members, and facilitate the development of tools and resources in the resource library. And it would also fund one full-time staff position at the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to lead program administration of the Green Mountain Recreation Fund, whose duties would be to develop and maintain information about grant opportunities, host trainings and other events to support applicants and grantees, develop and maintain a regular grant cycle, and maintain a grant selection process, the creation of the grants for nonprofit trail organizations for organizational capacity, and the creation of grants to be used by nonprofits and municipalities to advance the purposes of the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. So I don't know how much you have heard about recreational trails generally. There is established in statute the Vermont Trail System. That is the public trail system for the state. Generally, it is composed of trails that have been constructed, and then the trail organizations apply to be part of the Vermont Trail System. The Vermont Trails and Greenways Council acts as an advisory body related to this process. and is made up of different members related to trail organizations. And so then this bill also would create a more defined grant funding program for trails and providing more staff related to that. So that's H 131. So in addition to that language, H 467 also has an additional element which is related to funding for VOREC. So additionally, H 310, which is another short form bill, is included in 467. And so that would propose to appropriate $5 million to the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation in fiscal year 2024 for the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative, or VOREC, Community Grant Program. And so VOREC was originally created by executive order by Governor Phil Scott. And over the last 2 years, in 2021 and in 2022, it also received $5 million to fund outdoor recreation projects.
Fiscal year 21 and 22, is that what you said?
So the grant, I'm not sure what year but they were awarded in 21 and then in 22.
Oh.
And I think there may have been a prior round of awards before that as well. But yeah, this would just be giving another $5 million for that grant program.
Representative Lipsky.
Counselor, thank you for helping us out here. I'm led to believe in, not from testimony, but from discussion with FPR, that there still exists 5 million of undesignated funds still in the budget. It would be able, at least we're now working on 2024, that is the reason there is no additional request for 5 million, because there's still 5 million that's been undistributed. Is that correct or incorrect? And my source is in the room, so in all transparency, I'm learning this to some degree from Becca Washburn. But I think it's important to be clear when we're talking about these kind of dollars today, if that's accurate.
So I definitely can't speak to that then.
Okay.
I don't know the agency's budget. Also, there is a request, I just read it to you. So, and isn't that your language, 310? So I don't know where the budget stands.
And I've heard of taking credit for something. I am a huge supporter of funding outdoor. But to say that that's my language would not be accurate. I love to take credit for anything that's good, but I'm way too humble for that.
Okay.
Question, Jory. The point of order.
Point of order.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I was looking for confirmation. That's how ignorant.
So legislative council typically doesn't immerse themselves in the details of outstanding balances in administrative
I
accounts.
apologize for appropriateness.
No, and if I just misspoke about the way I just phrased that, I probably did misspeak. I did just look up the prior VOREC appropriations, so I don't know where the current budget stands. So you definitely should hear from the representatives of that program. Yeah.
And while we're on the subject of apologizing, I didn't realize that 310 was part of the same suite of bills, or I would have had you as the bill sponsor.
Representative Torrey is way more articulate on that.
Okay, well, in any case,
Now,
so we've gone through all the language on all three or possibly all four of these bills. So other questions just about the way that it's drafted?
Yeah, and so I would just speak a little bit about short forms generally, because I don't know if you've worked on any yet.
So that would be helpful, yeah.
So, short form, members of the House have the ability to request a short form bill, and there are a couple different reasons why a representative may go with a short form. One, there's a deadline for full statutory bills to be introduced. And so once that deadline is passed, the primary mechanism is to use a short form if someone still wants to introduce a bill. However, earlier in the session, if there's before the bill introduction deadline, a representative may use a short form if they don't have all of the details of a plan fleshed out yet, to the extent that drafting language wouldn't be helpful or possible. And so when you're looking at a short form, it's really giving you the broad picture. The committee that takes up a short form then has the discretion to make additional policy choices to fill in those details. And so like particularly with H85, that's a really short form, right? It will require a lot of additional language and will really fall on the committee to fill in the details of how they want to work within that bill. And so you may want to tease out exactly like, are you talking about just newly constructed trails or renovation? And that's really up to the committee that goes to work on it.
Good. Representative O'Brien.
So all short form bills, if they move forward, are committee bills.
No, but a short form bill can't be passed into law. So it needs to be taken up off the wall, and so it can still have its H number, but the committee really does need to put in additional work and potentially additional research to get to the point where language can be drafted. So you could not necessarily ask me to come back with an amendment to this bill the next couple of hours, because we would need to do additional research and you need to make some policy decisions before I could actually draft words. But it wouldn't necessarily need to be a committee bill.
So, and maybe an important distinction there is having passed crossover, it wouldn't be a committee bill in the sense that the Senate would take it up the way that they don't have to take up a non-committee bill.
Well, all right, so there's two things. So crossover has passed, and so you could pass a bill out of the House after you've filled in the text of the statutory changes. The Senate may not be able to take it up without.
Is that what it say, as introduced, but now a strike all amendment from the committee or even the sponsor?
It would be a strike all from the committee. Yeah, it would work like any other bill moving forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mentioned this morning before you were here that I had checked with the clerk just on the process and learned that before we ask you to do any work on an amendment, on fleshing out language, we should have at least an informal committee vote, and then
Okay.
then
Yes.
you'd be authorized to do that work. All right. Any other questions about the language? We have Ellen. Yeah, go
Okay, sort of jurisdictional matters, because short form are so more sort of broad picture, are there limits on, say all of a sudden we came up with, we wanted to attach one of the other bills to it, are there jurisdictional limits on that too?
Great question. Germaneness is one of my favorite topics. It would be a germaneness analysis like anything else. So I have seen creative things done with short forms, but something can only be found non-germane if someone challenges it, right? So you could attach additional things. I would advise you that attaching things on the same topic would potentially be germane, but the farther away from recreational trails you get, the more likely it would be to be non-germane. But again, it's only going to be non-germane if someone makes that challenge.
Who would that be?
It would happen on the floor. Yeah, it would be a motion on the floor,
Not the rules committee.
not the rules committee.
Interesting.
Yes. Secretary Bloomer of the Senate regularly tells me that he thinks most of the amendments that come to the Senate floor are non-germane.
Oh, wow, that's.
Because he has a very strict interpretation of the germaneness rule. But it really seems like germaneness only comes up with Act 250. So this is just to say, if no one challenges things on the floor and they pass, there isn't a problem.
So this is not specific to short form bills or any bills. It's always the case that germaneness is something that committees should bear in mind as they work on
Amendments. Yep.
Okay. Representative Lipsky.
Counselor, to Representative O'Brien's question, I went through orientation in late November, first day of December, and we were told about when you submit a bill, you can tell Ledge Council that if there are other bills similar, do you have our approval to share in case we want to join them into one bill or three ideas into one bill? Relevant to Rep. O'Brien's question, now once they got passed out, can we go back to Ledge Council and say, hey, we're all on the same train here? Would it be, can we actually join some at this point in time once three different bills have been posted on walls? If all the sponsors say, hey.
So once a bill is introduced, the sponsor has very little control over it. However, and you will begin to see this more as the session winds down, the committees have the ability to do that. I mean, but not the sponsor. So once a bill is introduced by a sponsor, it goes on the wall in a committee room and then is basically owned by that committee. So I don't know if you have an example or if you'd like to talk to me about some of that offline, but broadly speaking, once a bill is introduced, a sponsor can technically withdraw a bill from being introduced, but they can't necessarily combine. A sponsor can't make changes to a bill that's already been introduced. Only a committee can do that.
Thanks. Well, the examples might be 131, 467, 85, or the ones that were discussed this morning.
Sure. So it's pretty. So all
These are related.
right, and all those bills are actually in 467. Right. That's already how they've been made. But a lot of times committees themselves will do miscellaneous bills, which are sometimes called like Christmas trees, which is where you take a bunch of topics that are slightly related that may come from various bills and combine them into a bill. But at that point, it really is in the committee's discretion to do that. But yes, for example, S100 that just came over from the Senate. S100 has an amendment that was added in the Senate to add H332 into it. So they saw that the House had a bill that they wanted to include in their housing bill, and so they have that discretion. So, either working with Ledge Council to find language that you like or seeing that it exists somewhere already in a draft can help a committee achieve their goals. But it really is about what the committee wants to do, and you do have options on that.
And I think after lunch today, if the floor doesn't go all afternoon and we're back in committee, we can talk a little bit about what committee's next steps are on these various bills and nail that down. Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
So we had now we've had the introductions and we've had the walkthrough, and since to the bills, and maybe we can just think about, for the time being anyway, about 467, the more comprehensive one. Do you envision allocating some funding for a position with the Trails and Greenways group? We invited Nick to come back in, who's been sitting here absorbing all the conversation and will be even better prepared, I think, to answer some of our questions. And we'll invite him up next to the table. Back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Wonderful. If it's all right, I prepared a couple of slides. I thought that might be helpful. I was invited to both give a little bit of a recap on the Trails and Greenways Council, knowing how integral they are to the bills that have been discussed this morning, and then also provide a little perspective from the council on the legislation itself. So, and would you prefer to go along and just take questions as we go, or how?
Well, if you were happy to handle that however you want, if you want to just go through it, or if you don't mind being interrupted by questions as we go, sometimes that works better, I think.
Yeah, I'm happy to be interrupted.
Yeah, if you've got slides for us, we can either just pull them up, or if you would prefer to have them up on the screen, we can give you the access to do that too. How many slides do you have?
I've got 16, I believe, but I'll run through them very quickly.
Okay, yeah. Well, Laura, can you give Nick the ability
You don't have it?
I do. I think I can share. Let's see if this
Yeah, let's see.
works. I'll try to present. Hopefully that all shows up. Great. Cool. Well, thank you again for having me back this morning. Really excited to talk about both the council and then also these bills, which we're really excited about in terms of their ability to advance recreation in Vermont. One thing I didn't have a chance to do last time I was here was just step back for a brief moment and just talk about outdoor recreation in Vermont, a little bit of the big picture, and really what is world-class outdoor recreational landscape. We've got over 8,000 miles of public access trails. We have a growing hut service trail system, or huts that service that trail system, over 7,000 miles of rivers and over 800 lakes and ponds, more than 40 alpine and cross-country ski areas that service over 8,800 skiable miles. We've got over 6 million acres of land for hunting and 60,000 hunting license holders. Over 150 miles of accessible rail trails, including the Moyle Valley Rail Trail, 93 miles that was recently completed. We've got dozens of communities that are oriented around outdoor recreation, which a lot of that has been spurred on by the VOREC program, which we'll talk about. Access to natural landscape, served a vibrant and diversified outdoor business sector, and all of that within a 5-hour drive of 60 million people. So Vermont is a hotbed for outdoor recreation. I don't need to tell anyone here that, but at least put it in numbers. So the benefits of outdoor recreation and why supporting measures like this are really valuable. So the reality is that outdoor recreation drives health, economic, and environmental impact. Number one, it supports healthy and resilient communities. So both from a quality of life standpoint, not just for the old and young alike, across the spectrum of abilities, nurtures a healthier population, and then provides equitable access to the outdoors, and particularly those that have been historically underserved. Outdoor recreation also fosters ecological awareness and conservation. So in addition to fostering a beauty and a recognition for the outdoors, it's also outdoor public access recreation is a recognized purpose for conservation in Vermont statute. And critical to that are the best management practices and stewardship principles that underline how we build trails to make sure we're minimizing negative environmental impacts. And lastly, there's outdoor recreation is a critical economic driver. So we have hundreds of outdoor businesses that rely on our outdoor recreation infrastructure. It attracts and retains new residents. It links to a whole host of supporting infrastructure in terms of the businesses that aren't necessarily outdoor recreation, but provide the supporting elements. It's a driving force for over 13 million visitor trips annually. And then the big picture is that outdoor recreation as a portion of Vermont's economy, it contributes to more than 4% of state GDP. That's behind only Hawaii and Montana in the country. So it is a linchpin of Vermont's economy.
Nick, I'm going to
let's
pause here, and I'm sorry, but for the record, I'm not sure you gave us your name. And
I'm sorry.
affiliation.
I just walked in from the street and I figured I would say.
Yeah, just for anybody watching.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Nick Bennon. I'm the co-chair of the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council. I'm also the executive director of the Vermont Mountain Bike Association. And so those organizations are on the topic of organizations. Just a brief sort of sense of who's involved, because you're hearing a lot of different acronyms, names, organizations. So big picture, just the ecosystem of organizations involved in the outdoor recreation sector. We have the Agency of Natural Resources, critical in their role in terms of preserving and balancing sort of ecological preservation as well as use of public lands. We've got public land managers. Becca Washburn from FPR is here, from Forest Parks and Rec. Also the federal public land managers, U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife similarly manages public lands. Trail stewardship organizations, which we'll talk a lot about, towns and municipalities who host recreational assets, the outdoor recreation business community, organizations that are focused on equitable access. The ACCD, the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development, similarly plays a critical role in developing and supporting outdoor recreation. regional development corporations, many of whom have embraced or have focused on outdoor recreation as a critical driver. VOREC, and particularly the Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative, which sits underneath both FPR and ACCD, which we'll go into, and the legislature, who has funded and supported outdoor recreation critically over the years. So there's many different organizations that you could tap or hear from and their role and the value that they see in the outdoor recreation sector generally. What we're going to hone in on is really the stewards. So who are those that develop and maintain outdoor recreation infrastructure? And those critically are the public land managers. So within the Vermont ANR, we've got FPR, who's again with us today, as well as the U.S. Forest Service, those that create and manage assets on public land. Trail stewardship organizations, which I represent as part of the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council, and then towns and municipalities as well, and that develop and host resources on their town land. I note as well that the trail stewardship organizations that the Trails and Greenways Council represents oftentimes work closely in partnership. So in the case of Stowe, for example, the local VIMBA chapter, Stowe Trails Partnerships, works closely with the town to manage trails in the town forest. We've got partnership agreements with the Forest Service as well as FPR to manage mountain bike trails on state land. So the trail stewardship organizations don't purely manage trails on private land, which we'll talk a lot about, but they work closely in partnership with public land managers as well.
And how common are towns and municipalities working on trails and have dedicated funding or staff?
It's an excellent question. So we have a handful, I believe at least half dozen or so towns that are part of the Trails and Greenways Council that are sufficiently involved to participate, but it's a much larger number than that. And it's interesting because, so we work closely with the Vermont Recreation and Parks Association, who's kind of more focused on the playgrounds, ball fields, those type of facilities. But that's also kind of, there's a blurry line where those extend into town forests, where there's recreation going on. And so if you were trying to label it, I would say a large number, but I could be happy to try to get a better number for number of towns involved. So about the VTGC, and I won't go into detail here because I shared this previously, but the Trails and Greenways Council has been around since the late 80s. We represent over 50,000 individual members through our organizations who log over 100,000 hours of volunteer time to help maintain close to 8,000 miles of trail. We critically, as I mentioned before, we are the stewards of trails. Our organizations are of trails on private land, who host more than 70% of the public access trails in Vermont. So Vermont has this land use ethic of private landowners welcoming public access onto their properties generally, and that's where a majority of public access trails in Vermont reside. The last note, as I mentioned before, is that we work really closely with the public land managers as well. It's a partnership that we take very seriously in a couple of different ways that I'll talk about in a minute. Who makes up the VTGC? So we've got 18 statewide trail stewardship organizations, 10 regional trail stewardship organizations, a host of local and community groups, townships and municipalities. The state and federal agencies like Vermont Forest Parks and Rec are ex officio members of the council as well, so they weigh in and help direct our efforts. And then we actually have individuals and commercial members who participate as well. So it's a pretty big tent. It's one that we're eager to grow as we'll talk about what House 131 could help us do, but essentially trying to embrace all those that are involved in supporting trails in Vermont. The board, I'm not going to talk through names. I'm the co-chair, but we have a nice diverse board of 12 folks that we elect each year to steward the council. And then talking about stewardship specifically, which is what this House 131 is intended to really support. So the guiding principle for us is really balancing equitable access and responsible use of Vermont's landscape. So we take the importance of the natural sort of preservation and protection very seriously and think about how do we bring people into the woods and into nature in ways that are sustainable and minimize ecological impacts. To do that, we apply a host of rigorous best management practices, everything from planning and design to construction to maintenance. So we have, they're pretty serious in terms of what we've developed over the past decades to ensure that we're pursuing trail stewardship in a sustainable way. We're an official advisory group to the Agency of Natural Resources to advise on matters related to the Vermont trail system and outdoor recreation, and specifically work with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec to co-manage that Vermont trail system, which is the officially designated set of public access trails in Vermont, including those on private land. From a stewardship standpoint, we also provide input and as invited guidance to policymakers in terms of legislation that's relevant, one reason we're here today. And then we work continually with members and really view our role as one that is sort of continuous improvement, evolving over in time. BMPs increase or improve and strengthen. And so it's one that it's not a one and done idea. It's something that we look to continuously get better at over time. As I mentioned last time, we do play an official advisory role to Agency of Natural Resources, which is designated in statute. I noted it here. We also sit on the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative Board. We have 2 steering committee seats for motorized and non-motorized. We also advise on the recreational trails programs, which direct federal highway funds to the states to maintain recreational trails and trail-related facilities. So we participate in several different ways, but just to call out that there is an official designation in statute. As a partner, as I mentioned, our public land manager partnerships we take very seriously, and the most critical of those is with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec. So FPNR is a major landowner themselves. They're the single largest landowner in Vermont. They directly manage 360,000 acres and another 130 through conservation easements. We work together with them to manage the Vermont Trail System, who we sort of acknowledge are hosting public access trails, coordinate on policy and how we can think big picture about trails on both public and private land. And then, as I mentioned before, we have individuals, cooperative agreements, our organizations, whether it's the snowmobilers, VAST, or mountain bikers, VIMBA. We work with Forest Parks and Rec to help steward trails on public land. We also work closely on initiatives like SCORP, which is the upcoming statewide comprehensive outdoor rec plan that is going to be developed over the next year, potentially as well in 2024. And then work together similarly on developing those best and refining continually those best management practices to take both what the state is pursuing on state land as well as what our individual organizations have developed. A great example of that recently, Forest Parks and Rec, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Catamount Trail Association just released a backcountry ski handbook or ski and guide that's really a deep dive on the best management practices for managing ski glades and throughout Vermont. And so it's sort of first of its kind in terms of, and represents the partnership that we work through with the public land managers to develop and codify those BMPs. As a steward, I mentioned before, private landowners are really the key to our stewardship, then hosting that majority of public access trails in Vermont. Our individual organizations cultivate relationships with landowners over time. Trails can cross dozens of parcels rather. Landowners themselves receive no direct benefit. There's no recreation is not yet at least included in current use. There's no benefit other than landowners recognizing the value that recreation brings to their communities and the state. We do benefit greatly from the limited landowner liability provisions in Vermont statute that make it very difficult for a landowner to be held accountable for any injuries or on their property. And then we really work one-on-one with landowners to develop plans and communication and dialogue so that these public access assets can be maintained over time on private land. And so that's the sort of, I guess, the bright spots are the great, and the next thing isn't necessarily a dark spot, but the idea, what's the challenge really been recently? And it's over the past really decade, but even more acutely in the last 5 years, has been this dramatic increase in usage and that's not something unique to Vermont. It's something that over half of Americans recreated outdoors in some official way at least 2021. And that's been increasing every year since 2014. So outdoor recreation is growing as a sort of thing that Americans value. And in Vermont specifically, trail usage across types, across our member organizations, we've seen increases between doubling and tripling over the last 5 years. So in terms of the folks that are out on the trail and enjoying those resources. As I mentioned before, the idea was that the majority of these are on prior trails are hosted by private landowners without any real. The thing that's keeping them landowners in that Vermont trail system is the quality of the management and the relationships we have with them. And so the challenge with all that increased use is the threat really, without more investment and support for outdoor recreational stewardship, both the quantity as well as really the quality of our outdoor recreational infrastructure is at risk. And that's where we really, as an organization, are really wanting to see more support for stewardship to ensure we can take care of these resources. So talk specifically about a need or a specific example, I guess broadly, and then we'll talk specifically, but what do we need to be successful? Or what is the perspective from the council? So first and foremost, it's the idea of sort of the sustainability of support. So grant programs come and go year to year. Often they're directed specifically for projects. But what, as a community, that we're really seeking is dependable long-term. In the same way we try to build sustainable trails, we're really seeking sustainable support that's predictable. So that's the most, I think, critical piece to allow us to plan and to invest for the long term. The issues that we'd like to see solutions addressed, one is capacity for the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council to really to fulfill a technical support role and to ensure that we can guide our member organizations, that we can properly steward the Vermont and strengthen the Vermont trail system and fulfill that advisory role to the council. So that's something where Trails and Greenways Council relies purely on the donated time from our member organizations. It has no staff, and despite being recognized in statute. The second piece is organizational support. So we have a lot of these stewardship organizations, many of whom have existed for many years, but they're really shifting from pure volunteer sort of spare time weekend support to really needing to professionalize as that use has increased. They're hiring staff. They're trying to really step up their game to ensure that they can maintain those assets. So that idea of more support for organizations to do their stewardship work. And then the third sort of leg of the stool is project-specific support. So maintenance, upgrades, and repairs. The backlog we have of those, and we can talk about specific numbers, is substantial. When the URSA program was released a few years ago, the organization that I lead, VIMBA, we put together at least a quick and dirty assessment, and we had over $1 million of deferred maintenance, upgrades, and repairs on mountain bike trails alone, and put together a $400,000, $450,000 grant request from the URSA program, which the URSA program had many, many good things to fund. It did deploy $1 million towards many good projects, but VIMBA unfortunately didn't receive any of that funding. So that need is still on the table, and that's just one trail organization example. So a lot of specific upgrades and deferred maintenance that's needed. A specific example of a project that I think kind of represents that well is the Burroughs Trail that leads from Huntington up to the Long Trail to take you to Campbell's Hump. That 2.1 mile trail is currently undergoing a $750,000 restoration. Over the years, it's just been loved to death, as folks like to say. And the consequence of not acting over time and not really being able to invest in an ongoing way was trail widening, erosion, the environmental the consequences that come along with that, and then the need to really fully reset and rebuild that trail at the cost of $350,000 a mile. So that breaks down to something like $60 a foot. And when we think about maintenance costs, the number that VIMBA uses, it's more like $1 a foot to maintain a trail over time. So substantially less. That's still a big number. If you could do simple math and say $1 a foot, 8,000 miles of the Vermont trail system, that's a very, very large number, which is not what's in this bill. But a lot of that work is done by volunteers and done in ways that aren't pure funding investments. But the magnitude of support that's needed is, thinking about the amount of public trail and then thinking about the consequence of if trails aren't invested, then to maintain them once you get beyond a certain point is substantial. I might pause there because I've run through a bunch of stuff and we started to talk through details to see if folks have questions.
Any hands? Representative Levitt, I don't want to forget about you. I know you're resting your voice for tonight, though.
No, I'm good. No, I'm fine. I'm following. I don't have any questions, so thanks for checking in.
Great. I've only got a few more and then we can fully take questions. So, and I just added a few pictures. One is a trail, what it looks like before when it's sort of been beaten to death in terms of multiple trail braiding. So the idea that users are going anywhere they can find a path, water runs straight down the trail, creates erosion. That's when you talk about, okay, now we need instead of doing something where we could be maintaining and investing in trails over time, we're bringing in substantial amounts of rock hardening to make a trail surface that's durable. And then the labor and time and materials that's related to create stone steps and other things that are really substantial. And some of this is related to trail design too. This trail was designed over 100 years ago, straight up a fall line. The way that we build trails today, both from an accessibility perspective as well as from an environmental perspective, are not to go straight up a fall line because that's the way that water flows. So we think about building trails in ways that don't require that same level of maintenance. One thing I did want to highlight is where has this been done elsewhere? So in Montana, they established something called the Montana Trail Stewardship Grant Program. So in 2018, a group called the Montana Trails Coalition, which is very similar to the Trails and Greenways Council, they released a Trails in Crisis report, which really highlighted primarily underfunded or projects that weren't funded through the typical RTP program. So looking at all the things that have been left on the table and the potential to invest in those projects. Following that, the legislature, they passed a bill which established this Trail Stewardship Grant Program, the first $1.2 million of which were funded by an optional light motor vehicle registration fee. And then in the following year, a few years later in 2022, the legislature actually devoted a portion of the recreational marijuana state tax to this fund. So that fund secured a little over $400,000 in fiscal year 2022, over $1 million in 2023, and it's on track for a little over $2 million in 2025. And those are funds that go directly to this trail stewardship grant, which looks a lot like what is envisioned by the Green Mountain Recreation Fund. And that program thus far has awarded a little over $2 million to 73 projects across the state. So a good example of where has this been done elsewhere.
Representative O'Brien?
What's RTP?
RTP is the recreational trail program. So that's federal highway funds that go to the states to fund projects, which require a project match. They're overseen by Forest Parks and Rec. I can talk a lot more about the RTP program. But those projects are way oversubscribed in terms of the folks that apply. And so many of those projects go unfunded. All right. So to talk about 131 specifically, I don't need to tell you what's in the bill. You've heard several times what's in here, but just recapping that one of the pieces would be a dedicated role for the council to have staff support to fulfill its statutory role in stewardship, and then 2 roles for in the Department of Forest Parks and Rec, and then critically this fund that would actually support organizational capacity and projects to advance collectively the things that are envisioned in the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. But separate from the VOREC funds, this would really focus on stewardship rather than new construction of community-focused assets. To talk briefly just from the council's perspective about H131 from benefits, we really view that this and really want to give our thanks to Representative Sims for leading the charge here, that would secure essential lasting support for trail stewardship. So it critically augments capacity for both codifying and augmenting VMPs, so ensuring that how we build and maintain trails is really held to the higher standard, making more effective technical assistance, turning those BMPs into tools that our organizations, trail organizations, big and small, can use to make sure they're following them, and then active leadership. So as we think about, there are many things on the horizon, everything from conservation goals for the state to other challenges with climate change and things we face, the ability for the trail stewardship community to really step up and participate actively in those processes. As we mentioned before, it preserves and protects a bedrock of Vermont's outdoor economic economy. So trails, we really view trail infrastructure as sort of that bedrock that all of this 4.1% of Vermont GDP sits on. So ensuring that we're really protecting that. And then as related to the BMPs, but really preserving the environment. So investing in trail stewardship so that we can ensure that we're minimizing effects, whether user generated, erosion, what have you, and critically sort of ensure our ability to that adoption of a conservation ethic. So we view all of our organizations take the conservation purpose of outdoor recreation very seriously, and that ability to get people, Vermonters, to really appreciate nature and appreciate the importance of conserving land from development. And then lastly, as one of our the advocacy priorities or goals that I mentioned when I was here last time, we really greatly value the fact that this bill would also strengthen Forest Parks and Rec, who, as I noted, is our closest partner we work with. And additional capacity there, I think, would be transformative, or we think would be transformative in terms of ability to advance Vermont trail system and recreation goals just generally. So with that, I think I covered everything I had that I just wanted to share, and would love to just answer questions.
Representative Rice?
Yeah, so Nick, I wonder if you can so we've heard 85 and 131, and I think 310 is the other piece.
Yeah.
That's in 467, right?
Yes, you got them all.
And 310 and 85, the VOREC and the trail accessibility pieces deal more with new construction, and this deals more with maintenance. And I'm wondering if you want to comment on sort of the wisdom of putting them together in 467, or whether you think there's a preference to seeing them sort of remain separate and move forward that way.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think from the council's perspective, we really like that these bills are in one place in some degree too, because it takes a kind of a bigger picture look at outdoor recreation and trails, which says maintenance, let's take care of what we have. Think about accessibility, let's ensure that everyone can, or people can access these resources. And then thinking about new construction, like those make sense in terms of thinking about priorities as a community. We've met with Representative Burrows, I think, as Jill mentioned earlier. We really support that idea of strengthening and improving accessibility for trails statewide. So we think, and in some ways, like, these are all woven together as well. So they're not, we try to compartmentalize them, or they are compartmentalized in these bills. But one of the things we'd love to see on the accessibility front specifically is really an inventory that accurately captures the state of accessibility today in trails, and taking a view that in that bill specifically, they talk about U.S. Forest Service standards, which are the best set of standards we have for really truly natural service trails. But the reality is that accessibility exists on a spectrum. Speaking for my organization, or at least VIMBA, we work closely with Vermont Adaptive. And I think it was asked, is there an analog to Vermont Adaptive for summer use trails? And Vermont Adaptive actually works very closely, or does a lot of summer programming and things like that. And we have worked with them to conduct accessibility assessments for our trails to figure out like how accessible are these? The reality being that you have, on one continuum, you have completely inaccessible due to barriers or pinch points and things where you could not get. They're quite inaccessible to ADA compliant paths and things like that. And so understanding what we would love to see is is an inventory that gets a sense of where are those resources along that spectrum throughout the state, thinking about geographic sort of availability. And then, it's interesting. One of the programs that has existed previously was the URSA program. We mentioned it was 1 year in 2021, but that was enhanced recreational stewardship and access. So that program looked at grants for both stewardship and accessibility. And I think the majority of those awards were actually for greater access. So the idea that many cases, these upgrades we can make to trails also increase accessibility. So I think it's nice to have, particularly if these are short form bills that give you all a lot of latitude to think about how they might evolve. I think thinking about accessibility, maybe not purely for even new construction, to think about how does that fit in with what we have today? How can we support projects that when we're thinking about, we're restoring this trail or making some improvements. If we did just an additional incremental thing here or there, that trail could also become accessible for a certain portion of the population. So I think they're all woven together. And then the VOREC piece, which, we do need new infrastructure. We have communities that want to develop recreation. It's critical that we support them as well. So I think that it forms a nice, if we were to step back and think about where do we need to invest in outdoor recreation, those really touch on the three big pieces.
Representative Lipsky.
Nick, thank you. It's always, inspiring. You give more information in a shorter time than almost anyone I know, and it's clear and comprehensible. But you mentioned one of the latter slides about make a distinction between not-for-profit and profitable organizations. And I had the honor when you were here for State Outdoor Recreation Day in the State House, you introduced me to some folks who are doing a project for Stratton Corp.
Yeah.
And having lived and been an administrator down there many years ago, so Stratton is investing in a very impressive trail system, but the community of Win Hall, or the small community of the town of Stratton, not to be confused with Stratton, are they able to get funding to bring connectivity? It's like for Bonneville to develop and enjoy the impacts of that growth, to get support to connect to a system that's in place in a for-profit venture?
It's a good question. And there are examples, I think, throughout the state, particularly with ski resorts who are increasingly thinking about all-season viability and who are developing summer trails and summer initiatives. So Stratton's a good example. And Stratton, the town itself, the town forest, I know is getting significant additions of infrastructure this year. I believe our Southern Vermont Trails Association chapter is doing some work there. Bolton Valley, similarly, they're developing a lot of summer trails, accessible family trails up there, and are thinking about how can we connect those into other trail systems. It benefits them in terms of a better experience for the folks that are paying for access there, but also generates more public access trails. There's an interesting sort of connection because, you do get to a point. One of the things that the Trails and Greenways Council is really prides herself on is we're talking about public access trails that's no fee to participate, which is a critical thing when we think about barriers to access. There's still a huge community that's underserved economically in the state. And so there is a transition point where now you're paying to access trails at Stratton or Bolton Valley. But those resorts, or those areas generally, they are investing too in projects that they see the benefit of creating better public access resources in their communities. So Bolton Valley is invested in a new trail system that is being designed and built from the ground up to be adaptive, accessible in the town of Bolton called the driving range. So they've seen the value of, well, let's bring more recreation there, create resources that are public. They'll certainly get the benefit of, okay, there are people there, now they're going to go up to the resort to recreate for the day. But there's definitely a symbiotic relationship. As to the funding question, I mean, it's always, a lot of these projects are still scrapping by for funding. It's not, that is absolutely a constraint in terms of what can be done and trying to piecemeal things together with private philanthropy, with public funds, with membership dollars. It's a lot of piecemeal to try to put the pieces together from a financial standpoint.
Thank you.
Nick, before we wrap up, and thank you for coming on short notice, very short notice, and for the refresher and sort of helping us think now in the context of the bill proposals anyway. But currently, just so that we're all clear, the council is made up of various organizations. You showed us them. You're a co-chair. So there's another chair. Are there any paid staff, or are you all doing the work on a volunteer basis?
So it's the latter. So we all do the work and kind of share the load as much as we can. And a few years ago, as this demand for recreation and the need for the council's work increased, we sort of created the co-roles and saying we need more folks on the board. The board was limited to 8 members at that time. So we said we're going to have co-chairs, co-vice chairs to add people to really the board becoming it's a working board in terms of carrying the water on these initiatives. So we're at the breaking point of that right now in terms of what the board can do in terms of investment of that just spare and additional capacity. Fortunately, many of our organizations, VIMBA included, see the work of the council as so critical. The council is the designated advisory body. It represents everybody. We're much more effective if we can speak with a collective voice. So our organizations are willing to put in some of our time, but it is at a point now where, and we actually have we've raised some initial sort of seed funding from private philanthropy to say, we need a role, we need some staff support. So we anticipate, at least in the near term, hiring part-time staff to help us to advance this, with the hope that we can secure permanent funding in the long term. So we're taking steps, and we believe that sort of to some degree, we can show the value of that person will bring in terms of being able to advance our work on BMPs with the VTS, with just our general membership management. But to date, it has been entirely voluntary.
And is there a budget? Are there expenses that are there funds from membership fees or other sources that cover other expenses other than personnel?
Yes, we get we get funds from our membership, our member dues. We get some amount of grant funding that's has at least to date been relatively small. So there are, and we host membership meetings. We have certain expenses, but to date they've been relatively limited, given that we haven't had a paid staff person to execute a lot of this work.
Good. All right. Well, I think we can stop there then. So again, thank you for